Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is AdiAgain, here to talk to you about Metal Gear Solid. Excuse the terrible David Hayter impression. But welcome back though, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. As a lot of you out there may know, not long ago I rebranded and am now, of course, AdiAgain. And like I said in my announcement video about the whole thing, my plan was to play through the Metal Gear Solid games. I started my journey as my previous name, IrritableIndian, 6 years ago with Death Stranding, and ended it with platinuming Death Stranding 2, and I figured it would be poetic and really cool to finally get around to playing the first 4 Metal Gear Solids, which I have never played before. I've only played the 5th game, and it's my favorite stealth game to this day. I absolutely love it. I've played it to death, but I've never played the first 4 Metal Gear Solid games. I figured that it would be really fitting to play another one of Kojima's amazing adventures here, and one of the most important, influential stories and franchises of all time. So we did that. We played Metal Gear Solid for the very first time on stream over the past week. Took me 2 streams to finish the game, 18 hours, which to you Metal Gear heads out there may be pretty embarrassing considering it's a 10 to 11 hour game. So what the hell took you so long, Addy? Sorry. I'm gonna get carried away a lot with doing terrible David Hayter impressions. So yeah, as usual, I'm here to bring you guys my quick review of the game. Yes, I know it's been out for 27 years. It came out in 98 on the PS1. So a lot of you guys out there have already had the chance to play it. And I know I'm tardy to the party, but hey, I made it to the party nonetheless. Yeah, I'd imagine not a lot of you out there would care about spoilers, but still, I want to give people who haven't played these games a chance, because not every human being on planet Earth has played them, to see my thoughts on the game if they would like them before going into them, to get an idea of what to expect, and to also be able to experience them for themselves from beginning to middle to end, almost completely blind, because that's the beauty of, playing games, especially incredible ones like this game, where you get to go through them for the first time, not knowing what to expect, and experiencing all of that for yourself with no anticipations, and having a really magical time as a result. I should preface this review by saying that a lot of what I'm going to say about Metal Gear Solid is going to sound very predictable to a lot of you out there, especially the fans. Obviously, this is the game that put Hideo Kojima, one of the most renowned video game directors of all time, on the map, and there's a very good reason for it. Metal Gear Solid is one of the most important games to the video game medium. It not only set the foundational building blocks for stealth action as we know it today, but it also introduced the idea that video games are able to be more than just a medium for playing something fun. They're also able to be a powerful storytelling tool. Kojima introduced so many cinematic storytelling techniques in this game. In a way, it's like playing a Steven Spielberg film. But what's amazing is that this was back in 1998 during the PlayStation 1's console generation. And this is one of those games like, Final Fantasy VII as an example that came out the year before, my favorite game of all time, that did everything it could to utilize the hardware of the system as well as work creatively around its limitations in order to make something special. And boy, oh boy, did it do just that. Metal Gear Solid for its time tells an incredibly mature, poignant story about the horrors of war and nuclear weaponry. This is a series that's fundamentally about those themes at the end of the day. There's a lot of political anti-war messaging in these, and the first game tells that beautifully. I mean, I said this a bunch during my playthrough of the game over on my stream. It's one thing to know how important this game is, but it's a whole other beast to actually experience the game for yourself. And I was blown away at just how incredibly well written and realized the story of the game as well as its characters were. The beautiful thing, in my opinion, about Kojima's games and what makes him unlike any other, and yes, I know that it can sound a little bit overdone to sing his praises and hail him as a genius, but I can't lie to you guys, he absolutely is, because he brought to the table the idea that, once again, video games are able to be movie-like cinematic experiences. Like when you watch the cutscenes of this game with the PS1's limited polygonal graphics of the time, you forget that you're experiencing a game with very dated graphics. I was completely enraptured with the story and its presentation. The presentation here is immaculate. Once again, this feels like a Spielberg-esque Hollywood espionage movie, especially when it comes to the direction, right? The camera angles, the cinematography, the way everything is composed, the way the characters talk to one another, and how everything unfolds, the pacing. It's wonderful, man. And this is a classic example of a timeless masterpiece, no doubt about it. My jaw was on the floor several times throughout this playthrough. I'll link my playlist below on my VODs channel that has the full playthrough of the game, so you guys can watch through and see my reactions and my experience going through it. But you'll notice on multiple occasions that I was just in complete silence watching the conversations between the characters and the cutscenes unfold. And towards the end of it all, especially the credits, again, my jaw was on the frickin' floor because I could not believe that I had experienced something of that caliber knowing the year that it came out. And I was always just putting myself in the shoes of a kid who must have played this game on a CRT back in '98. The idea that games were rapidly evolving back then, and out of nowhere you would experience landmark titles like this, it just makes me wish I was there to see it. It's one of those things that people say you have to have been there to see it. Absolutely. The leaps and bounds in technology and hardware at the time must have been mind-blowing, and experiencing stuff like this really gives me that perspective. It really allows me to put myself in those shoes. But that's neither here nor there. All this is to say is that Metal Gear Solid is one of the greatest games of all time. No doubt, period. If you want to experience games that served as very important milestones in the industry, then this game has to be on that list. This is one of those complete package games where every single facet, once you experience them and put yourself in the shoes of someone who would have seen all of this stuff at the time that it released, will make you fully understand how this ended up being on the map and put Kojima on the map and absolutely solidified him as one of the greatest of all time in this industry, if not the greatest, in my opinion now. Prior to playing this game, with Death Stranding 1 and 2, which I consider to be one and the same and my third favorite game of all time, I thought Kojima was one of the greatest directors of all time. But I think this game solidifies him to me as the greatest game developer or director of all time. No freaking doubt. So in Metal Gear Solid, you play as Solid Snake, one of the most iconic video game characters of all time. In a game with many iconic elements as you play, like the sound effects of when you get alerted by the guards because of his dummy thick cake and his ass cheeks that keep clapping and alerting them. Damn it. Sorry. And of course, your comrades going, "Snake, what happened? Snake!" when you die. Oh my god, this game is just, even if you haven't played the Metal Gear games, you've probably heard those sounds before. You probably set those as your text tones if you were growing up in the 2000s. Again, without even realizing the game they were from, because they just sound awesome. This game also just had incredible, impeccable, memorable sound design. But yeah, Solid Snake, one of the most iconic characters in video gaming, definitely in a top 25, top 10, maybe hell, even top 5 list, is the hero, the protagonist that you assume control of in a game where you're on an espionage operation, of course. This man is coming out of retirement. He's being sent by a body of the government to an island called Shadow Moses in order to rescue a group of hostages being held by the terrifying Foxhound organization, again with, wait for it, iconic enemies and villains. Liquid, Gray Fox, Sniper Wolf, all of them with their stories and just the character designs as well, which is something we're talking about here. Yoji Shinkawa's impeccable character art and realizations make this an unforgettable experience. I think just Yoji and Kojima in conjunction with one another always create such punchy video game experiences because you have characters who embody and represent such amazing ideas, but then they look so awesome as well, right? I've known about a lot of these characters for a long time, and by extension, I know a lot about the story of the Metal Gear games between 1 through 4, but I've just, again, never experienced them. And like I said, it's one thing to know about them, but a wholly different beast to finally experience them. And definitely out of all of these characters, Sniper Wolf, oh my lord, defeating her as a boss, not really a spoiler because these are all enemies, these are all bosses that you're going to be fighting. That cutscene that plays, one of my homies in the chat, Shibby the Shinobi, whose favorite game is Metal Gear Solid 2, told me that this made him cry at 10 years old. And I was thinking to myself while watching the cutscene that, you know, if I were a youngster playing this game as well, then I'd probably be really emotionally impacted as well. That was the case with my favorite game of all time that was on the PS1, Final Fantasy VII, due to its really emotional, poignant story beats. But I found myself getting chills and being really moved by the cutscene that followed the boss fight with Sniper Wolf, which was beautifully directed and written and realized ultimately. And in that one cutscene, I went from not knowing basically anything about the character who I had just beaten to knowing her entire story and also really empathizing and feeling really sad. And everything in this game, from that cutscene to everything else presented, really ties in and cycles back to the incredibly important and powerful anti-war messaging that Kojima ultimately tries to relay to the player. And I didn't realize before this game just how well written Solid Snake is. I, to be completely frank with you guys, thought that he was just an iconic character because of his appearance. And David Hayter, oh my god, don't even get me started on David Hayter, man. The GOAT. Easily top 3 voice actors of all time. I thought it was his design, his voice acting by David Hayter, Colonel. You know, the stealth stuff, the combat, all of that, that made him so important to so many gamers. But it turns out he's also just so well written. Basically, this whole anti-war perspective the game has going on is relayed so amazingly well through Solid Snake or David. This is a character who is basically a mercenary who throughout most of the game is fighting really just for the profit and for the thrill of battle, and thinks that he only gets fulfillment from that and that that's all his life amounts to. This is a character who is pretty much genetically bred only to fight. And on top of that, his genes aren't even that strong. They're really weak and futile. And I really liked that angle the game had going on as well, because it kind of ties into one of the themes that I find incredibly resonant from my favorite game, Final Fantasy VII. The idea that even though you might ultimately be someone weak, you can do something incredibly important and influential and strong and good. You discover the idea through this game that life is worth living and it can be beautiful, and it isn't all just about the horrors of war, through the unlikeliest character. Again, Solid Snake, this callous mercenary who's basically been bred just to fight. And the culmination of all of that at the end is absolute cinema, dude. It's just cinema. That's all I can really say. So yeah, the story, the themes, the messaging are just so incredibly timeless, pertinent, and important. And I think a lot of you may already know that. I definitely already knew that before going into the game, that these would be the ideas that the game would be, you know, playing with. But again, it's one thing to know going in, another thing to experience all of those. And this presentation, which is just wonderful. And yeah, I cannot wait to play the rest of the Metal Gear Solid games to see how, you know, Solid Snake's story continues, even though I know there are other characters at play. This is an incredibly complex, intricate canon, and, you know, there are multiple players in the chessboard. Some games don't even feature Solid Snake. I know Big Boss is also really important, and is the character that I am more familiar with. I've actually never ever played a game with Solid Snake in it before, right? Like I said, MGS5 was my only exposure to Metal Gear. So it's going to be awesome to see how all this stuff connects, and I'm excited to be back here reviewing those games. But yeah, I just had to gush over the technical innovations of this game and the story to start with. Just so much amazing stuff here. An incredibly mature story that is timeless. Technical facets, you know, full 3D, being able to go into first person view, and in-engine cinematics, right? Because back then, those things were practically unheard of. You would, from time to time in these PS1 games that used optical media to really push boundaries, at most experience, you know, pre-rendered 2 to 3 minutes cutscenes here and there. This game not only has those, which are very inventively realized in the form of real-world footage, but throughout the whole thing, you have movie-like, film directed-esque cutscenes taking place in the same vicinity, same engine that you are physically controlling the game within. So it's, seamless between gameplay and the cutscenes, which is pretty much how we get cutscenes in this day and age now, all the freaking time. This was something incredibly revolutionary back then. I also mentioned this multiple times while playing the game. This game was probably like what it was to see something as beautiful as Death Stranding 2 when it came out not long ago, back in 1998. Going from games you typically get that were half 3D, half 2D, like the Final Fantasies, for example, on the PS1, to something like this that is full 3D, despite the polygonal graphics, like that, those are insane graphics at the time. It must have been like, watching the opening gameplay of Death Stranding 2 through the hills of Mexico in this day and age and just being awestruck that a system is capable of outputting this. And it really makes me think that, every game that Konami and Kojima have put out over the years have been the landmark, boundary pushing games for their respective systems. Like if you want to see the most beautiful looking games that have come out on, the PS1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, then I would say look no further than the games that Kojima worked on, because they absolutely were those for their, respective generations. Another thing I really like about Kojima games that I want to say is that even though they're so movie-like, right, and feature long cutscenes and long conversations between the characters, like in this game, the codec calls, like when Snake calls in to the Colonel or any of his fellow comrades that are there to help him on his mission, a lot of their talks can just go on for minutes, like 10 to 15 minutes almost. But you just don't feel the time going by because they're incredibly well written. But that's kind of besides the point that I want to make here. Despite his games being very film-like, they don't forget the fact that they're meant to be games at the end of the day, and that games are meant to be fun, that the player is here to enjoy their time, and this game represents that really well. Obviously, its biggest innovation of the gameplay front is, again, stealth action. There really were no stealth games quite like this before, and this paved the path for stealth gaming as we know it today. If you play it today, the stealth will obviously feel very rudimentary and dated, but it's still really cool and really fun. For the most part, you're dealing with little enemy dots on your radar who have vision cones. You want to stay out of the vision cones if they see you. Then you go loud, you have to run away, hide from them, and then come back. Or you just stand your ground and mow a bunch of them down with the various weapons and gadgets you have in your arsenal. While the classic alert theme blares in the background, the dun dun da 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 dun dun da da da. But honestly, what really surprised me about this game was the fact that the stealth didn't really feel as prevalent towards the end of the experience. And what I mean by that is going into it, I fully expected that the stealth would stand out the most. Like, yes, I did know I was going to in for an amazing ride with the story and the characters and all of that. But what I didn't realize was the fact that the stealth would end up being secondary to all of that. That at the end of the day, I would come away from this experience wanting to talk way more about the story than anything else, really. As well, what overshadows the moment-to-moment gameplay of Snake, stealthing around the guards are the boss fights. 200% the boss fights against every member of Foxhound on Shadow Moses Island. Now, these actually put me through the ringer quite a bit, and are the reason this game took me 18 hours total to complete, because I was fumbling around for most of these fights, not understanding how to get around the unique gimmicks of each boss, and also having trouble with the controls, because the controls are obviously very dated, 90s controls. It was like using a PS1 controller without the analog sticks, having to wrap my head around the fact that circle back then was to confirm, not cancel, and X back then was to cancel, not confirm. Having to scope in with the right bumper, shoot with square. Little things like that, which I never really got used to until the very, very end. So yeah, there'll feel like there are a lot of dated 90s mechanics in the game, but in spite of the fact the fights were pretty grueling for me, and by the way, I was playing on normal, right? There are difficulty settings, and I was only on normal, and they were still pretty grueling. Despite that, I actually really, really, really enjoyed them. I think they were brilliantly realized, and they really kind of made me think to myself that there's something we've kind of lost, and I talked about this during my stream through as well, in games since this era. I know there are a lot of games out there that still do this and still make strides to do this, but what I really noticed about Metal Gear Solid, between this game and also Majora's Mask, which I played more recently, is the fact that games back then really tried their best to make everything a puzzle, right? Obviously, Metal Gear Solid isn't a puzzle-heavy game series, right? But at the same time, the obstacles presented to players, especially in this game, aren't immediately apparent as to how to solve. And you need to use, the clues in your environment, everything you've got at your disposal, put them together to figure out the solution. And the boss fights felt like that especially. And your main go-to clue in this game is the codec, right? The device that Snake has in his ear at all times that allows him to communicate with his comrades that give him tips while he's out in the AO. Obviously, the iconic Colonel, Mei Ling, who allows you to save your game whenever you call her. Master Miller, one of my favorite characters from, Metal Gear Solid 5. And this guy are all there for you to call and get tips and tricks and advice from as to how to get around the bosses you're fighting in the moment or a certain area you might be stuck in. And it's great. It feels like you have a team that's working together while you're out there in the AO as Solid Snake to get the mission done. I think it's one of the greatest aspects of games from back then that we've lost. Of games not hand-holding too much and letting the player figure out the solutions for themselves, and also keeping things rather open as to how you want to approach them, right? Because in this game, there are multiple solutions to some of the bosses as to how you want to fight, and you can either go with the way that makes sense to you, like, maybe you're being chased around by this big dude with a huge-ass minigun. You could either go, okay, maybe I'll place down claymores to blow him up, or maybe I'll shoot a missile from a Nikita rocket launcher and guide that to his butt and blow him up from behind. You have a pretty solid, no pun intended, number of options as to how you want to approach each situation that's presented to you. And I really did like that a lot. Obviously, there was a bit of 90s game design jank here, especially with some of the bosses towards the end of the game. Aiming wasn't the best in video games back then, and it definitely wasn't. And Metal Gear Solid, despite how brilliant it was, at the end of the day, is kind of victim to that aiming system where you're standing still, and if you scope in, you can't move the character himself. You can only move your reticle. Leave yourself open to frustrating attacks here and there while you're stationary. That's definitely an aspect of gaming I don't miss. But again, the way in which this game tries to create so many mind-blowing, creative, inventive situations for the player, right, to allow them to experience something they've never seen before, is wonderful. I'll obviously talk about this part, even though it's kind of a spoiler, but it's just so iconic. So many of you know about it out there. I knew about it for the longest time before I played the game, and I was still amazed by it. But obviously the elephant in the room, the Psycho Mantis boss fight, where you have to take your controller out of port 1 and plug it into port 2 while he's reading the memory card on your PS1, where he's basically freaking you the hell out, showing how he's a psychic, reading your mind, controlling the situation. And the only way to beat him is, again, moving your controller to the other port and stopping that from happening and then taking him down. That was great. And I played the Master Collection version of MGS that came out recently on my PC. So if you're wondering how that works, so the whole take out the controller from port 1 and put into port 2 thing works for that, basically you just pause the game and there's a setting that allows you to change from port 1 to port 2, which is pretty cute. So yeah, so many things like that in this game, and so many little tidbits of Kojima humor, Kojima-isms. And you guys, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Only people who've played his games and seen his games, seen the memes, will know what I mean when I'm saying this stuff. But it was really cool, from the perspective of somebody who's played his newer games, going back to one of the very first ones, or, the first one that is in the vein of his newer stuff, his movie games, essentially. Like, Kojima wanted to be a film director, but he couldn't, and he ended up making video games and instilling movie qualities into them. Metal Gear Solid 1 essentially being the first example of that. It's cool to kind of see that all of the stuff that you recognize as staple Kojima elements were there from the very beginning in Metal Gear Solid 1. A neat little example I can think of off the top of my head. Whenever new characters appear in cutscenes, you see their names in a caption as well as the actor's name in brackets who played them. So little things like that, they were all there from, the very beginning. And I love that. It's just, he's approached all the games with his signature style, but they've just looked better and played better over time as hardware has evolved. He's always looking to make the greatest games he possibly can in his own style while pushing the hardware to its limit and doing creative things with the hardware, you know, introducing neat little gimmicks that's only possible in the hardware that his games are coming out on. Like, again, the Psychomantis controller trick for beating him. This game is, again, just timeless at the end of the day. And yeah, it's solid. A solid 10 out of 10. Damn, that might be my worst attempt at a David Hayter impression yet. But yeah, guys, probably a lot more that I want to say on this game. You could tell this video is probably going to go on for minutes. The raw recording here is 44 minutes long. It'll definitely be shorter than this. But I have a lot to say, as you can tell. I love this. I couldn't believe how good it was. I couldn't, genuinely. And I'm so glad I finally got around to playing it. I couldn't have chosen a better game to play as AdiAgain, you know, with this new journey that we're starting on my channels and content creation. And I cannot wait to be back here talking about Metal Gear Solid 2. I would like to ideally get through all of these games and then maybe do a tier list or something like that with you guys. That could be fun, right? But yeah, this is a masterpiece. I think so far, for those of you guys who might be curious about this, Metal Gear Solid 1, now that I've played 2 of them between the 5th one and this, I don't think it's my favorite one in the series. I think it has the best story, though. You know, playing this, if you guys know, you know, when it comes to Metal Gear Solid 5, you know, Kojima and Konami had a tumultuous relationship and the falling out, yada, yada, yada. And the story wasn't able to be fully realized and live up to the full potential that people were expecting. This game makes me understand, because I'm fine with Metal Gear Solid 5's story, right? All things considered. I didn't think it was bad. Yes, there could have been more because I was enjoying it a lot. But I was okay because ultimately the gameplay is what really, really, really carries the experience. And what story that's there is directed wonderfully. But seeing this game made me truly realize and empathize with the folks who were really disheartened at not being able to get more stuff out of MGS5's narrative. So all this is to say, I think this game has the best story so far, but MGS5, obviously, still the best stealth game of all time. I think that when all of this is done, that'll still be the case. I think the stealth stuff has just gotten better and better and better and better over time. That's like progressed, you know, in an upwards trajectory. But obviously, I think the story is the most interesting thing to be in this ride for. Those can be all over the place because they're, you know, purely subjective. And when something like this sets the bar so high, you can't be disappointed when the things that come after it may not live up to it. But what's amazing is I've heard from so many people that Metal Gear Solid 2 definitely did. Even Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which that, to be honest with you guys, is the one I'm looking forward to the most. I'm going to be playing the original, even though the remake is out. But my point is, this game caught lightning in a bottle. It took strides to prove that video games can be on the same level as powerful cinema and literature storytelling. And that is what makes it so special at the end of the day. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for me today. This has been a fun review, Colonel. And I hope to see you guys next time for the Metal Gear Solid 2 review. But until then, keep on keeping on.